So it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Charles Card this evening. For more than 4 decades, Charles Card has pursued the implications of the Jung-Pauli collaboration and von Franz's work on number archetypes. He has presented lectures at the University of Helsinki, the Assisi Conference in Vermont in 1999, as well as the Towards the Science of Consciousness conferences in Helsinki and Tucson. His writings have been published in the journals of Psychological Perspectives, Mind and Matter, and in various essays, collections, and conference proceedings. From 1980 until his retirement in 2016, he was an instructor at the Department of Physics and Astronomy, University of Victoria. His formal studies were undertaken at the University of Victoria, Reed College, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institution.
Excellent.
So we've also, the board is also, and our society really has had the pleasure of having Charles on the board. He is a founding member of the Jung Society, and really there's no doubt that he's one of the very best people to be discussing this this knowledge of Jung and Pauli. So I'm really excited to present Charles here tonight, and I am going to pass it over to him.
Thanks so much, Geneva. I'm just going to share my screen here. How's that looking? Geneva, are you able to hear me?
Looks like you're good to go there, Charles.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, and welcome this evening to our presentation. I'm very excited to have you here and to be with you and to tell you this story of synchronicity. What I'd like to do, first of all, is take you for a bus ride. Now, you've probably been in a major city anywhere in North America or Europe and seen these big tour buses that roam around the cities, and hopefully you've been on one just for fun. I'd like you to imagine that you're on a big bus with me. I'm the guy in the front with the straw hat and the microphone and the wind blowing past his ears. I will be pointing left, right, and back at all of the different sites that we're passing by rather quickly. It's regrettable, in a sense, to just have a whirlwind tour past some really, really interesting sites, but at least we get to know the terrain. Geneva's schedule that she put out for me is my schedule as well. So we'll be having, after about 50 minutes to 55 minutes, maybe a little rest stop for 5 minutes plus in order to just take a break and refresh and get back to it. I'm going to talk about the principles involved in this story, the three individuals, Jung, Pauli, and von Franz, in the first half. And then, just as Geneva said, I will get into synchronicity proper, take a deep dive into how that was developed conceptually and the personal aspects of that development process as well. But the first thing I'm going to do is put on the brakes and say, anytime that you put three people out or three of anything out, you may wonder, is there a fourth that's missing or unaccounted for, unacknowledged? And yes, there was in this case. Carl Alfred Meyer is the fourth, a very important fourth. He was the fellow who edited the collected works of the collaboration of Jung and Pauli. And he did this at the later years of his life. He was not able to access the collection till 1987 and after that. Meyer was born in 1905, and he was the first president of the Jung Institute, and he also held the chair that Jung vacated at the ETH for many years. He was there as a professor of psychology. He met Jung first at age 18 and went into the University of Zurich to study medicine, earned his degree, became a psychologist, and worked closely with Jung, Wolf, and Emma Jung, and was very close to Wolfgang Pauli. They were lunch mates often when there was something that Pauli wished to discuss with Jung. It was not uncommon for Meyer to go with Pauli as well, and they would all sit together and discuss the topic. So he is a very important force in this whole picture. When I started to think about this presentation, I said, well, maybe I should check out what is happening in contemporary writing and research about dreaming and about psychology, depth psychology in particular. So I did a little bit of digging. This is a book that was published in 2015, written by Jennifer Wint. She is a cognitive theorist, took most of her training in Germany, and is working in Australia right now. There's 825 pages in this book, so my God, there should be something about Jung. So let's go to the index and look, and no, there's no mention of Jung. We moved from Jouvet to Cahen. And so in 825 pages, Jung finds no home. Let's try another book that is even newer. It came out just last year. It is written by Antonio Zadra and Robert Stickgold. Zadra is at Université de Montréal, and Stickgold's at Harvard Medical School. And maybe I'll have better luck with them. So I go to Jung, and there is a little bit here, and archetypes get brief mention on 2 pages. So I have some hope. There's something on paranormal experiences. I wonder if synchronicity is there. So let's go find out. No, nothing on synchronicity. So why is that? And I think we'll be able to get some tentative explanations of that, why this is a forbidden territory for professional researchers in psychology and even in particular in dream research to venture into the topic of synchronicity. So I'm going to whiz right by Carl Jung. You know him, I think, very well, I would hope. Here's a bit about his life in his first 55 years. We know he was born in 1875. He did his medical schooling at the University of Basel, and he worked at the Bergholzi. He married Emma in 1903. He connected with Freud in 1906, and that fell apart by 1913. He moved to Kuznakt. He withdrew from the Bergholzi, began private practice. In 1913, roughly, he entered a period of intense introversion, a confrontation with his unconscious. That has been well discussed, well documented in recent years. We'll get into that in a minute. As he came out of those times, he bought property at Bullingen and began the construction of his tower, his first tower. And he began to travel to the USA and then to Africa and to Egypt. And he, by the end of the 1920s, he was just encountering alchemy and in particular Wilhelm's golden flower. Now, the major writings that Jung had up to that time were the source of much of what we've taken away of his the major points of his work, archetype and collective unconscious and the psychological types. All of those aspects came out of these works that were all prior to 1930. And we for a long time, we heard about his personal work, his black books and his red books, but they were behind lock and key for a very long time, and they just only recently have been available to us. And in fact, we can put them and have them on our bookshelves. Here's the published copy of the red book. I would imagine you've had a chance to look in that, and it's a wonderful thing to behold. I just want to read you just a few lines from the epilogue that Jung wrote in 1959. He had let go of the book for many years and was just returning to it. He wrote, I worked on this book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. The beginning of the end came in 1928 when Wilhelm sent me the text of the Golden Flower, an alchemical treatise. There, the contents of this book found their way into actuality, and I could no longer continue working on it, meaning the work on the red book. So he made a very specific shift in his energies and his efforts away from the introverted perspective into a new direction in which alchemy and synchronicity were going to play huge roles. This fellow here, Wolfgang Pauli, was his major collaborator. He was a physicist that was born in 1900, and his mother, Bertha, but was traditionally called Maria, was an intellectual, a socialist, a feminist. She studied literature and drama, and she followed basically the pattern of her father, who was also a writer and a playwright and a journalist. And later, his daughter, Bertha, would follow in much the same footsteps. That Pauli's father, Wolfgang, as well, was he was a doctor. Actually, he studied medicine at the Karl Ferdinand University in Prague, and by 1892. The family moved from Prague to Vienna. Now, the family name up until that point was Paschels, but in the move to Vienna, the family changed their name from Paschels to Pauli, and they converted from Judaism to Catholicism. The father became a professor at the University of Vienna, and later became the director of a medical colloid chemistry institute there at the University of Vienna. Pauli was born in 1900, and by 1911, the family had left the Catholic Church, and they were baptized as evangelists. Pauli was not aware that he had Jewish roots until he was 16 years old. There he is as a young child. Here he is as a 16-year-old, and then just as he's matriculating from high school and heading off to the University of Munich. Now, there were two people in his household that were, besides his mother and father, that were extremely influential on him, and one was his sister. The sister was born roughly 7 years after him, between 6 and 7 years. And she had a very different temperament and a direction in life. She became an actress at 18. She appeared in theaters in Berlin and Breslau until 1933. Then she collaborated on film and radio projects, wrote plays, acted as a literary agent, moved from Berlin to Vienna to Paris, and finally, to escape the Nazis, she made her way to the US in 1940. Now, when she was born, Pauli, as a little child, felt very shocked and displaced by this new arrival, his sister. And he would later tell Jung that he felt that the arrival of his sister was coincided with the birth of his anima. Now, there was another person in the household, another extraordinary individual, as a guest, as a family friend, that would go on to have a deep impression on Pauli and influence on him. This is Ernst Mach. He was, at the time of Pauli's acquaintance, he was a professor of the philosophy of science at the University of Vienna, but he had a longer history with the Pauli family than that. Ernst was the father of a young man, Ludwig, and Ludwig and Pauli's father were close friends. And in the process, Pauli's father became a friend and a teacher to him as well. And when Pauli's family moved to Vienna, it turned out that Mach as well moved to Vienna and took up a position there. So he was very often found in the Pauli household at the time of Pauli's childhood. Now, Mach was originally trained as a physicist, but he became a philosopher of science, and he's best known for his universal phenomenology. And just to give just a thumbnail of what his thought, and particularly the thought that was most important to Pauli, Mach held that the laws of nature are economic summaries of human experience, that sensory impressions are psychophysical flow. We'll hear that term again. A psychophysical flow that does not distinguish between subject and object, between internal and external experience. In other words, what we experience is psychophysically neutral. And this made a deep impression on Wolfgang Pauli. It turned out that Ernst Mach was not only influential to Pauli, but also to Albert Einstein, and was one of the major philosophical influences for Einstein's formulation of the special theory of relativity. Because of and despite of the presence of these powerful men, his father and Ernst Mach, Pauli became, at a very young age, a critical thinker. He would graduate from the high school and go on to the University of Munich. And he had been so well taught, homeschooled, as it were, by Mach and his father, as well as getting an excellent education at his high school, that he was so accomplished at the age of 18 that he was able to write 3 essays on general relativity. Now, general relativity is Einstein's second theory of relativity, which he published in 1915. So only 3 years later, an 18-year-old young man, Pauli, could write very fine essays that attract the attention of some of the people who were leading in research in that area. When he got to the University of Munich, his supervisor Sommerfeld found that he was so gifted that he had nothing to learn from him. In other words, he was ready to receive his doctorate at that time. Could it be awarded to him? But it couldn't. Munich required 6 semesters, so he didn't graduate from there with his doctorate until 1921. What Sommerfeld did was to ask him to write, go back to the general relativity work and write an encyclopedia article. That article eventually became a 250-page book, and Einstein would praise what Pauli had written in that book. So Pauli moves on from the University of Munich to Göttingen University. He spends a year there studying with Max Born. While he's there, there's a Bohr festival. Now, Niels Bohr was a preeminent physicist, and he came to Göttingen for a special celebration. And at that time, he met Pauli. And he was so impressed with Pauli that he invited him to come to Copenhagen and study with him at his institute. Pauli did that, and then the next year, then he worked with Lenz in the Hamburg University, which was actually close by, and then came back and studied a year again at the University of Copenhagen. The 3 fellows in the picture there are, of course, Pauli and a young Werner Heisenberg, and then Niels Bohr, and they were a team of very influential young, in this case of Pauli and Heisenberg, influential physicists who were joined by others at the Copenhagen Institute, and they formulated the theory of quantum mechanics. Okay, in the Hamburg years, Pauli had received a basic professorship, a docentship at the university, and by the 1924, he had formulated the Pauli exclusion principle, and in another 20-some years, he would be granted the Nobel Prize for that work. If you think back to your days in high school, you probably remember the periodic table, right, from chemistry or physics, and all of the elements displayed in nice, neat order. The periodic table was not doable until Pauli had articulated his exclusion principle. It explained how the different elements were different, and it explained how material objects, such as composed different atoms, and in particular, let's say a small object, a particle like an electron, how they were distinct from each other. Now, there were three ways of types of distinction for elementary particles like electrons. They would have 3 quantum numbers that were known at that time. And interestingly enough, what Pauli did was to hypothesize a 4th quantum number. And with that, everything fell into place, and we could understand how the different chemical structure was obtained. Throughout his years in Hamburg, Pauli remained close with Bohr, Heisenberg, and all the visitors that came to the Bohr Institute. In 1927, 26, Einstein is visiting with Pauli, and then by 1927, the Copenhagen, the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics is formulated, and that's the work, as I say, of Pauli, Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and several other people accomplished that, and that became the theoretical standard, and pretty much is still, although there's some issues around that. In 1928, Pauli becomes appointed a professor of theoretical physics. It's his first full-blown professorship at the ETH in Zurich. and his life is well launched from an apparent professional sense. If life were just always so easy. Pauli was not an easy person. As a child, he was very precocious, as you can imagine. He was really an enfant terrible that remained terrible throughout the rest of his life. He was very quick to find flaws in logical and mathematical reasoning, and he was a skeptic with an extremely sharp tongue. Have you heard the phrase "not even wrong"? That's sort of still in the parlance these days. Not even wrong was one of his witticisms. He became known as Pauli the Terrible, or as God's whip, but he was also so well respected that he was considered to be the conscience of physics. Niels Bohr, in a retrospective statement about Pauli, he said, he was not only disrespectful, this he was very much, he also possessed a very special lucidity of thought and a very special intellectual honesty. And I think that's how a person with this temperament could still, navigate the environment and the people in it that he was with. He also became very well known for the Pauli effect. Now, the Pauli effect was something akin to what later would be acknowledged as a synchronistic effect. Pauli could go and would go into a research lab. He could have his hands in his pocket. Nevertheless, something would break. It was so well known and so predictable in the sense that something would go wrong that in fact he was barred from several researchers' labs, just not allowed to come in. And these are hard-bitten, physicists, no-nonsense folk who nevertheless were so superstitious about Pauli that they banned him from their labs. We'll have more about the Pauli effect as we get going here. So a person of his temperament is a person that's likely to have trouble in his life. He recounted that his neurosis had already become quite apparent in 1926 when he was living and carousing in Hamburg. He stated that his exclusive preoccupation with science had suppressed all other human qualities, and in particular, it harmed his emotional life. The expression of this imbalance was a vivid contrast between his daytime and nighttime personalities. It also manifested in his relationships with women. He developed a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde duality. On the one hand, he was a brilliant, famous conscience of physics, and on the other hand, an alcoholic ruffian, frequenting bars and getting into fights. He was lonely and paranoid. In 1927, things got much worse. His mother died. She was ill with pneumonia, and she consumed a poison, apparently, some kind of medication or whatever that, in any event, seemed to have led to her death. He had a positive relationship with her, but it was quite hostile to his father, and particularly when the father, who had been adulterous before the death of the mother, married a young woman Pauli's age. He left the Catholic Church in 1929 and married a cabaret dancer, a vaudevillian dancer that he had met in Berlin, Käthe Deppner. And they were only together for a few months. By the November of 1930, they were divorced. So he was severely depressed, and he developed a phobia that had started as a child, a phobia around wasps. So Pauli in 1931 had done some whirlwind lecturing and touring throughout Europe and then into the US. And when he got to Ann Arbor, Michigan, he got drunk. It was alcohol it was Prohibition era and alcohol was forbidden, but they still managed to get alcohol down from Canada. And he got drunk and he fell on the stairway and he broke his shoulder. So he ended up the lecture tour with his arm in a cast, stuck up as you can see it in the picture. He got home and his father basically told him enough's enough, as well as a friend. And they said, you need to get help and we suggest you to see Jung. And so he did in the January of 1932. He would visit with Jung, and Jung gave him a 20-minute interview and then arranged for him to be seen by Dr. Erna Rosenbaum. Now, Rosenbaum was a physician, had studied medicine in Munich and Berlin before she came to study with Jung. She had studied analytical psychology from 1925 until she arrived with Jung, studied in Munich and Berlin. So she was not a neophyte, but Jung considered her to be such. And he tasked her to just basically sit with Pauli and let him divulge what he could from his dreams, but not to analyze him. And Jung totally removed himself from the scene so that he could get Jung's dreams without any involvement by himself at all. So here's a bit of fun, actually. Pauli was asked by Jung to write a letter of introduction to Dr. Rosenbaum. And here's a bit of it. He says, the background is that I consulted Mr. Jung a week ago because of some neurotic symptoms, which among other things had to do with the fact that it is easier for me to achieve success in academia than with women. Since for Mr. Jung, the opposite is the case, he seemed the right person to ask for medical advice. My surprise was not little when Mr. Jung explained to me that this was not so, and it would be imperative for me to be in treatment with a woman. So you can see some of Pauli's tongue. He's 30, just coming to 32 at that point, and wanting to go into treatment under Jung, but writing in such a manner. Anyway, he sees Rosenbaum through October 1932. He records 400 dreams in that time. Just amazing. And Pauli begins to then see Jung after Rosenbaum leaves. And in November there of 1932, he records another 60 dreams to the end of the year. And so in total, he in 10 months, he's provided 460 dreams and 72 drawings for Jung to work through. Jung would work with him until 1934, October, when Pauli requested that they discontinue analysis. What has happened with Pauli is that he's married again. And in April 1934, he's married Franca Bertram in London. They had met in 1933 in the housewarming of a friend, and the relationship and the marriage proceeded. And Pauli then felt that he would discontinue his analysis. He knew he had lots of work to do, but he thought maybe he should take a break with the formal analysis. Okay, so Pauli's life became completely normal, as Jung would describe it. Of course, this was in appearances, but to a great extent, he was able to pull off a life now where he was, avoiding alcohol and being the esteemed professor at the university and just getting on with what was available with him. He had even had some a bit of a reassociation with his father there. The father is with Frank in 1936. They had a house in Zolingen, Zolkon. Things would progress until they were forced, more or less, by the circumstances to leave for the United States under the duress of the growth of Nazism in Germany. Even living in Switzerland, it was not safe. Pauli was not Swiss by that time, did not have Swiss citizenship. He'd applied, but had been turned down. And so he was on passport, he was still German, and he needed to get to safer quarters. So the analysis ends, and what would just be a simple collaboration, well, not a simple collaboration, quite a complex collaboration, would begin. In that period of 1930s, he had provided Jung 860 dreams in the next 10 years through the war years. In particular, there were only 36 dreams that found their way to Jung. And then in the 50s, another 83 dreams were provided by Pauli to Jung. And then there were a total of 315 associated letters about the dreams that Pauli provided to Jung. So this is all material that Jung had in his filing cabinets, an amazing amount. Jung was free to use it, but he had to keep Pauli's identity anonymous. So Jung would set work on it, and he did. He looked at, first of all, out of that first 400 dreams that were taken under Rosenbaum, he identified 59 of them that had mandala symbolism as discerned by Jung. So he picked those out in particular, as well as some 22 initial dreams. And he set to work on those. They became the subject matter of his first lecture at Aranis about the dreams. This is actually his third Aranis lecture, but his first mention of the dreams came in August 1935. And it was focused on the mandalic aspect of these dreams. He would then lecture in London about the various portions of the dream series. The next year, he would go to Maine, to the Bailey Island, and speak about them there. And in the following year, 1937, he went to Yale University and to New York City. And again, he took up the same dream series. But what had happened in the intervening time was that Jung became deeply, deeply interested in alchemy. And we have an understanding that he had some knowledge of alchemy from even the 1911, 1912 era, and that by the end of the 20s, he was taking up alchemy as he studied the golden flower. But his deep dive into alchemy really didn't take place until about 1936, 1937, and that was at the same time that he was looking at Pauli's dreams. So by the time Jung has worked through these 59 dreams to his satisfaction, he is now relating them, the individual dreams as symbolism, he's relating it to alchemical symbols. Okay, I'm not, Jung went to the US to talk 59 dreams, and I think he only talked to, and spent 2 weeks at it at that. So I'm just going to give you a whiff of them. You can find them in the collected works in psychology and alchemy. But let me just give you some of the scent of these dreams. You find the ocean and huge snakes, and in many indefinite female forms, nymphs, and veiled female figures on staircases, and unveiled face like a sun. This is all getting into his relationship with his anima, which was, well, let me put it this way. If you've ever had a flat tire and you tried to proceed driving on with the flat tire, you know how difficult that is. Well, that was Pauli's predicament. He had a flat tire, and his flat tire was due to the total absence of his acknowledgement of his anima. And so then in the process of his work, and a lot of it was, and most of it was his work with himself, with self analysis of his dreams in those first 2 years, he became aware of his anima and knew that he had to deal with and get on with that prospect. So the progression in the dream series, those 59 dreams, the progression is a feminine figure that is largely absent and then portrayed in a diffuse multiplicity. Eventually a singular, unknown, strange, dark woman appears. First she's veiled, then she's unveiled, has a face like the sun. Eventually she takes her place in a quaternio of the characters that appear in his dreams. She appears first as a silent doll woman, and when she begins to speak, she reapproaches him for neglecting her. She becomes a guide for him, and she even at one point becomes pregnant. For him, her development seems to be crucial to help him find the center and to square his surroundings. And it's finding the center and the squaring his surroundings that have led to the mandalic symbolism that Jung has picked up on and put forward. So at the end of at his time with Rosenbaum, in fact, she is gone, and he's just taken up with Jung. Pauli produces one of his most elaborate mandalic drawings, and one that has gotten around. You probably have seen images of this. The left-hand side is Pauli's own sketch, and the right-hand side is that of an artist. This is Pauli's Great World Clock. You can find discussion of it in several places in the collective work. That's Pauli. That was Pauli to the point that we need to leave him for a while and move on to Marie-Louise von Franz. And let me just be very quick here because our time is slipping. But she's a young woman who first met at Pauli first met Jung when she was 18 years old. Here's her mother, Margaret Suzanne, born into the Schoen family, married to Baron Erwin Gottfried von Franz. And this was in Austria. He was an Austrian, she was a German, but they lived in Vienna. And that, of course, is where Wolfgang grew up as well. Marie-Louise von Franz was born in 1915. So Pauli, 1900, he was 15 years older than her. This is Marie-Louise, the smaller one, with her 2 years older than her sister, Marie-Anne. They, as we know, the war was lost to the Austrians lost, and the father, who had been very heavily involved, he served actually, the father had served on the Joint Chief of Staff of the Austro-Hungarian Army and was on the Isonzo front in World War I. He had to leave, they had lost, and they made their way to Switzerland. And by 1918, the father in Switzerland had contacted the Spanish flu that was very prevalent at that time in Europe, and he became seriously ill and invalid. So tough times. She's just a small girl, 3 years old, when all of this has fallen onto her family. At age 4, they moved to a village outside of Zurich called Rheinick, and that's where she grows up. She goes to primary school, and then in 1928, she actually is in high school in Zurich. Her sister was also attending high school there, and it was a high school that specialized in language and literature, and that was fortuitous for her. In 1930, her family lost all of their money, a great deal of their money, as a result of the Great Depression. So things got harder and harder. By 1933, she had, as an 18-year-old young woman, she had met Jung, and she'd met him out in Bowling, in fact, and that was a game changer for a very young person. She entered in that fall. She started her studies at the University of Zurich and studied in philology, studied Latin and Greek, and she minored in literature and ancient history. And she would get, to the extent that she could, also involved in Jung's lecturing that took place at the ETH. Only 1 year later, 1934, at age 19, she becomes, she goes into analysis with Jung. Another year after that, she already begins her discussion of the archetypal content of fairy tales, which she would carry out for another 9 years. She worked as I guess you would say, the silent author of another individual, Hedwig von Beth, who took credit for von Franz's work, but contributed very little. In recent days, her work on the symbolism of fairy tales is coming back under her name. Jung invited her to the Aranis conferences. Her first one was in 1937 at the age of 22. So he trusted her and felt she was ready for this kind of exposure at a very young age. She would attend Jung's lectures. Her family and herself would receive Swiss citizenship. She received her PhD in classical philology in the 1940s. She's becomes closer and closer to the Jungian folk in Zurich. She becomes an associate member of the psychological club. She begins giving talks, their lectures there. By 1942, after a discussion with Jung, she begins to see her first analysans. She's at age 27, she's become an analyst. She becomes a full member of the psychological club in 1944, and her father dies in Zurich at that same year. Her mother sells her house. Marie-Louise moves into a small room in Zurich. Marie-Louise and her mother had a very difficult relationship, and she was off on her own at that time. Less than a year later, at age 31, with the suggestion of Jung, she moves in with Barbara Hanna, who was working with Jung. She was 25 years older than von Franz, and they would end up living together for the next 40 years. That's where I'm going to stop right now. I will, let's take our break as we had hoped to do, and we'll do our deep dive into synchronicity proper, and let's give ourselves 5 or 7 minutes anyway.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm just going to leave everything, all the video and everything on, and I'm just going to pause the recording, and we'll see you guys back in about 5 minutes or so. Bye.
Excellent.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to hand it back over to Charles.
All right, let me just get launched here. I thought I'd left it elsewhere. Okay. Okay, are we good?
Looks great, Charles.
Okay. I want to actually get right into synchronicity and what it could be. Well, let's just give some examples of what have been or could be identified as being synchronistic experiences or events. Now, we've all heard, well, I don't know that we've all heard, but let's say most of us have heard that Jung's scarab beetle story has been repeated again and again. And I think it's in writing and in verbal recordings. It's very much out there as a synchronistic experience. So I won't go into that, but I'm going to go into a synchronistic event that Joseph Cambrai recorded. Now, he is the CEO and president of the Pacifica Graduate Institute. And here's the story that he tells. Now, he has he had a patient who is a severely traumatized person that he saw multiple times per week. And it was such a difficult case that if he was not available, she would sometimes need to be hospitalized while he was unavailable. After considerable analytic work, the patient asked to remain out of the hospital while he was going off on a 10-day vacation, and to just have her consult her psychopharmacologist as backup. And they had agreed to one scheduled phone call while he was gone. And that was arranged before he left town, and they would speak at the designated hour while he was away. So at first, during the call, the patient was quite agitated, quickly recounting her dream from the night before that I, the analyst, was in the Black Forest and lost to her. She was terrified and asked if I were in Germany, because I was aware that her inability to retain the analytic experience and memory was leaving her exposed to severe abandonment trauma. I responded concretely, perhaps naively, reassuring her that I was not in Germany. I did not disclose my location in the Caribbean, but I could see that she felt in danger of losing contact with me. The day after the phone call, I went for a second lesson in scuba diving. After a morning of work in the pool, the diving instructor decided on the spot that I should come along on the afternoon's dive. It would be my first in open water. It was therefore with some trepidation that I joined the other seasoned divers as we headed out to sea. I was thoroughly shocked to discover that the site chosen was called the Black Forest. Here's another one. Again, this is just anecdotal. This is no longer Cambrai's work. A man has a friend who lives several hundred kilometers away that is dying from cancer. It is a protracted descent that has gone on for more than a year. One night, the man dreams that his friend is standing before him, dressed in summer clothes, a white shirt and pants, sandals, and he looks tanned and fit. The dreamer proclaims, "You're well, you are recovered." The friend says nothing, but his eyes twinkle with amusement. In the morning, a phone call confirms that his friend has passed. Another example. A young couple is awaiting the birth of their first child with the due date less than a month away on the 21st. They are becoming increasingly anxious because they live several hours away from the nearest hospital. One night, the dreamer has a very simple dream consisting only of the persistent image of the face of a clock. The circular clock face is divided precisely into halves by the hands of the clock, which reads 6 after 7. With that division, a single whole becomes 2, but 6 after 7 is 13. The child is born on the 13th. So synchronistic episodes are not necessarily about death or birth. They can be quite fun. In fact, here's another one. A man has awakened in the morning with the intent of celebrating his birthday. He goes to the kitchen to make a cup of espresso, and he asks his wife if they still have any of his favorite biscotti. She sadly tells him that they have none. Immediately, the doorbell rings. Outside the door, a box has been left by a friend that he hasn't seen for several months. In the box are his favorite biscotti. And here's another one in the same vein. A woman is shopping at a shoe store in the local mall. After careful searching, she finds just the right boot, the right style, color, and size. But the price is too high, however, and she decides to leave them, hoping that they might go on sale at a later date. She returns home, and as she arrives at her door, she discovers a plastic grocery bag hanging from the doorknob. And in the bag are a pair of new boots that are identical in every way to the boots that she has just left behind. These boots were left by a friend who was helping to clean out her mother-in-law's closet. Another example, excuse me. A divorced man has lived apart and more than 200 kilometers away from his former wife for more than 6 years, and contact with her has been infrequent and impersonal. One night he dreams that he is in the hallway of an institutional building. He opens a door and steps into a dimly lit room. Looking to the right, he sees his former wife laying on a small bed, covered by a blanket and apparently asleep. He slowly pulls back the blanket and sees dozens of tiny crabs crawling over her body. 2 days after this dream, he receives a telephone call from a third party that informs him that his former wife had gone into surgery the previous day to remove a cancerous tumor. And finally, I'd like to play this one. You may have seen this one. Let me make sure it queues up here. This was from a 1972 BBC documentary called The Story of, where are we here? It's the story of C.G. Jung. Oops. Let's get this going.
"1961. The sky suddenly darkened over the vacant Küsnacht. Coincidence for Jung had always been full of meaning. Just over 10 years ago, almost to a day, Dr. Jung died in this house. Then, as now, it seemed as if nature recognized the event. A great thunderstorm swept over Zurich. Lightning crashed and destroyed one of his favorite trees in the garden just over here, where he used to sit. And it was symbolically in the unconscious of hundreds of people who've known him and read him, as if a great ship had gone down and dragged towards it, like flotsam and jetsam on the sea, all sorts of strange dreams and portents to accompany the event. But what was even more significant was the fact that 3 days before he died, Dr. Jung, who had been quite well, had perhaps the last of the dreams that could be communicated to men. He had just finished his last written work, a work on symbols. And the dream came to him. The first of which said, the first of which showed him high up in a high place, a round boulder, a great boulder of stone. And on this stone was inscribed the words, "Take this as a symbol of your holiness and the singleness you've become."
That was Sir Lawrence Vanderpost, who was narrating the story. Let's go on to where the collaboration begins through correspondence. And this is immediately or very closely after Pauli has removed himself from analysis, but they now are still very much in contact. And Pauli is sharing his dreams as he would throughout much of the rest of his life. Pauli is starting to put things together for him around the issues with his anima, and he connects his wasp phobia to his anima complex. I'm just going to read a statement that he made. The alternating light and dark stripes must be diametrically opposed psychic attitudes or dispositions to forms of behavior. People, moreover, they are very closely related to religion and relationships toward other people, as well as to sensual feelings, eroticism, and sexuality. The specific threat to my life has been the fact that in the second half of life, I swing from one extreme to the other, an antiadromia. In the first half of life, I was a cold and cynical devil to other people and a fanatical theist and an intellectual enlightener. The opposite to that was, on the one hand, a tendency toward being a criminal, a thug, which could have degenerated into me becoming a murderer, and on the other hand, becoming detached from the world, a totally unintellectual hermit with outbursts of ecstasy and visions. Now, Pauli had received in his dreams images that were very physical in nature, in the sense of what you might expect, even kind of illustrative of textbook physics issues and concerns. And this would actually occur throughout his life. And he knew they had psychological interpretations as well as what the explicit physical images were related to. So he started to compile a lexicon where he was relating the physical terminology and imagery with the psychological aspect. And so this lexicon started back in 1935, and it would continue to be a project of his for at least another 20 years. Meanwhile, Jung has sent Pauli a copy of that 1935 Eranos lecture about Pauli's dream content. And Pauli would reply to that and remark about the birth of his sister. And he would also go on to make a remark about the dark anima as he was learning more about it. He says, I would like to here sometime what you think about the collection of dreams in the material I sent to you earlier, in which the dark anima asserts with a certain persistence that there is a magical connection between sexuality and eroticism on the one hand, and political or historical events on the other. This is the aspect of the anima frequently represented in dreams as Chinese. So the anima is already starting to be refined from a dark woman to now one with a Chinese character. He would go back to comment about this stream of images that he is experiencing, and how some of these, the most modern physics lends itself to the symbolic representation of psychic processes, even down to the last detail. He mentions that he's studying the alchemist flood, and that will come up years later than when he's doing his Kepler essay that would be published alongside of Jung's Synchronicity essay, was in the early 50s. Pauli then sends several successions of his dream material to Jung, and is leaving the country to go to Princeton. During the war years, Jung would have a heart attack that led to a near-death experience in 1944. Pauli, on the other hand, was awarded the Nobel Prize, which he received officially in 1946 for the exclusion principle. He was also awarded a US citizenship in 46, and Swiss citizenship would follow in 49. He was stateless when he was in the US during World War II. He had not been granted Swiss citizenship. The US turned him down for citizenship initially, but it's a wonderful thing a Nobel Prize can do for you, is get you multiple citizenships, and he did. He would return to ETH and to Zurich in the summer of 1946, where he would resume his lecturing. And with his return, the correspondence between the two men continued. Okay, he would be sharing his dreams with Jung, and he referred back to his work on Kepler as well as Jung. The C.G. Jung Institute was just getting launched, and Pauli had agreed to become a sponsor of the Institute. He went on to present his Kepler lectures in two parts in 1948, in February and March. And most significantly, in 1948, in one of his correspondences, he attaches an essay that he's written. It was never published, but it's a significant piece called Examples of Background Physics, and in which he explores this issue of the physical symbolism coming into a psychological and into dream aspects. And in that essay, he includes two dreams that will become relevant as we get further along into talking about synchronicity. So by November 1948, synchronicity is on the table. The term is being used in their discussions. Jung had previously used it in 1928 in a colloquia, and then he would use it in Wilhelm's memorial address in 1930. An interesting note that shows Pauli's progression at that time was that in an earlier dream episode in 1946, there was a cluster of things that emerged or were brought forward at that time. His Kepler lecture, the idea of a neutral language, and then the further pursuit of the archetypal background physical terms were all triggered off in him at that time. So that's 1946. Jung now has produced a manuscript and he gives it to Pauli to read. Pauli criticizes it for various aspects. He's an extremely critical reader, and it's not a surprise that he would criticize what Jung has written, criticizes what he's written about the Rhine experiment, parapsychological experiment, and about how Jung had treated astrological material in this manuscript. He also pointed out to Jung, apparently Jung was not aware of it, that Schopenhauer had offered a precursor to the synchronicity concept. But the biggest thing for Pauli was to take issue with the way time was treated in talking about synchronicity. Synchron basically is pulling up a simultaneity that Pauli thinks is not correct either in terms of physics or logic. He prefers, instead of talking about synchronous events that are without cause, not causally connected, in other words, acausal, synchronous or simultaneous events. He prefers to talk about simultaneous, or about events that are connected by meaning, so meaning correspondence. And Jung would come back with his own take on that, which was to talk about meaningful coincidence. So moving away from simultaneity in time to coincidence of meaning. Jung sends now to Pauli a revision of that manuscript. We're up to late November, or late 1950 in November. And Pauli is now reacting to a very significant issue that he feels that they need to sort out. They're both aware that there are acausally connected phenomena in physics and quantum mechanics, and then there are the acausally connected phenomena in synchronicity in the narrowest sense of that term. Pauli says you have to make a very large distinction between these two types of acausal event. Jung had tended to put them both under the same umbrella and call them both synchronistic events or phenomena. And Pauli wasn't happy with that. Jung then goes into sort of a rethink about synchronicity, and he stays with still the umbrella understanding, but he looks at synchronicity as applying to three different categories. One, a coincidence of two psychic states. Two, a coincidence of a psychic and a non-psychic state or event. And three, the possibility of a coincidence of two non-psychic, or in other words, physical events, as one would find in quantum physics. Pauli reacts to that, and he weighs the pros and cons of Jung's approach and his own misgivings, and he decides to accept Jung's broader, more inclusive umbrella kind of definition, with the understanding that that there is a good conceptual distinction made between acausal physical phenomena and the synchronicity in the narrower extent. They also begin to talk about connecting the notion, the concept of archetype as it appears in dreams and such, with what is appearing in quantum mechanics and quantum physics as the determiner of structure, namely the law of probability. Jung likes that, but he will go on to say that the archetype represents nothing else but the probability of psychic events. And this leads to movement towards a new interpretation of the archetype based on this analogy between an archetype and probability. Finally, Jung has modified his manuscript once again, and he has now sent it off to Pauli for final look. Pauli is largely in agreement with what Jung has written, and this is now February 1951. And Jung then presents 2 lectures on at the Psychological Club in Zurich on synchronicity. Pauli reflects upon what he's heard and returns Jung's manuscript after that point. And then Pauli himself completes his Kepler essay. And those are the 2 major constituents for this combined work that they're going to publish together as Naturerklärung und Psyche, published in 1952. So that is how synchronicity got into print, and it's pretty heady stuff. There were still a few more things to sort out. They first had a coming together over some of their outstanding differences. Pauli liked the notion of a psychophysically neutral standard language, and he thought this was really important. Jung agreed. Pauli would say, more and more I see the psychophysical problem as the key to the overall spiritual situation of our age, and the gradual discovery of a new neutral psychophysical standard language also seems to me an indispensable prerequisite for the emergence of the new hieroscamus predicted by you. And Jung would come back at him again in an approachment to Pauli's language. Jung would say, I use the speculative concept of the psychoid, which represents an approach to neutral language, in that it suggests the presence of a non-psychic essence. Is a matter of choice whether one fills up this essence with the term matter. So Pauli's talking about psychophysically neutral issues, aspects of archetypal appearances, and Jung is talking about the psychoid archetype, but essentially they're pretty much talking about the same thing. Jung then moves on to what is sort of the next progression in their collaboration. Jung says, among the things that are part of the substance of the psychic are psychoid archetypes. The characteristic that is peculiar to the archetype is that it manifests itself not only psychically subjectively, but also physically objectively. In other words, it's possible that it can be proved to be both a psychic inner occurrence and a physical external one. I regard this phenomenon as an indication of the fact that the physical and the psychic matrix is identical. So this physical and psychic matrix is what Jung would borrow, would characterize from a borrowed term from Dorn, that of a unus mundus. But they also diverge as well, and it's a very substantial divergence that it would prove to be. Jung would remark, as he saw things, given these circumstances, the task facing the 2 disciplines, namely physics and psychology, is to locate and describe the region which is indisputably common to both. My dreams and my intuition have both referred me to natural numbers. These seem to be the simplest and most elementary of all archetypes. So and Jung would go on to make a fairly multi-paragraph major statement about what he had understood number archetypes to be about. And he's clearly pointing them to Pauli for his consideration. Pauli writes back, he's getting ready to travel to the US. This is now in 1954. And he says he wishes to postpone to a later date a detailed reply to your letter, especially regard with number archetypes. So he defers and he doesn't want to talk about it. In fact, he never does. Jung will come back to him almost 2 years later from this previous poke to Pauli, and he will gently argue for him to consider number as archetype, but Pauli never does take that up. There are reasons for that. It's too much to get into tonight, for sure. Let's just say Pauli is not just simply ignoring him, but there are technical reasons why he might not have wanted to consider number types. Okay, what they did agree on and what can be sort of encapsulated is, I call this the archetypal hypothesis of Jung and Pauli. And so just to wrap it up all in a bow, here it is. These are the points. The realms of mind and matter, psyche and physis, are complementary aspects of the same transcendental reality, the unus mundus. Archetypes act as the fundamental dynamical patterns whose various representations characterize all processes, whether mental or physical. In the realm of psyche, archetypes organize images and ideas. In the realm of physis, they organize the structure and transformations of matter and energy, and they account for acausal orderedness as well. Archetypes acting in both realms of psyche and physis with meaningful coincidence account for instances of synchronistic phenomena. A psychophysically neutral language might be possible to develop that would be capable of providing highly unified descriptions of reality in both its physical and mental aspects. Okay, that's very heady stuff. And now we're going to move down a little bit and go to heart issues. And we'll roll back out. That ended where we ended with Jung and Pauli. There was 1954, 1955. We'll actually roll back to the late 40s, mid to late 40s. Pauli has returned to Zurich, is taking up his Kepler article work. Jung is working on alchemical stuff. And von Franz is now very much on the scene and very capable of helping with translations from Latin and Greek, and is just very generally canny and capable of provoking the discussions that are going on between Jung and Pauli at that time, and profiting from what she's hearing about, either firsthand or indirectly. Pauli fell in love with von Franz, and he would make that clear in a letter in January 1951. And at that time, she was 36, he was 51. He would get cooling feet at that time. He would back away a bit and suggest by that April that they entertain amor celestis rather than amor vulgaris. So he wants a more of a spiritual love to form between them. Von Franz is affected by him, and they do have a multi-year personal relationship that would involve many exchanges of correspondence, many walks in parks and city streets and so forth, discussing the issues that that were at hand, and discussing Pauli's dreams in particular. He is he is still trying to sort out some of his major issues around his anima and what his anima is prompting him to do. So let's go in and explore that a little bit. Pauli will talk about his anima in later letter to Jung. He expands on the dark one. On the subject level, a special form of the dark one has long been appearing in dreams and fantasies, namely the Chinese woman or the exotic one with the typical slanted eyes. These indicate a particularly holistic view, but one that is insufficiently connected with my rational ego. As a feminine anima figure, however, she is linked with emotional interest, which is accompanied by a stimulation or animation of the pairs of opposites. She sees connections other than those of conventional time, yet there always appears to me a figure that has the tendency to reproduce itself and to be at the basis of the perception of the Chinese woman. This figure, one can also, in a certain sense, call it archetype, is psychic and physical, which is why the Chinese woman first appears as the bearer of psychophysical secrets, ranging from sexuality to subtle ESP phenomena. Now, she is very much on scene in his dreams, and one of the most significant dreams that he records was recorded on September 28, 1952. I will read it, it's not too long. The Chinese woman walks on ahead and beckons me to follow. She opens a trap door and walks down some steps, leaving the door open. Her movements are oddly dance-like. She does not speak, but only expresses herself in mime, almost as in ballet. I follow her and see that the steps lead into an auditorium in which the strangers are waiting for me. The Chinese woman indicates that I should get up onto the rostrum and address the people, apparently to deliver a lecture. As I'm waiting, she dances rhythmically back up the steps through the open door into the open air and then back down again. As she does so, she keeps the index finger of her left hand and her left arm pointed upward and her right arm and right index finger pointed downwards. This repetition of this rhythmic movement now has a powerful effect in that gradually it becomes a rotation movement, a circulation of the light. The difference between the two floors now seems to diminish magically. As I am actually mounting the rostrum of the auditorium, I wake. Pauli's relationship with von Franz. So that in October, November 1953, he writes an extended active imagination that he dedicates to her. So originally 21 pages, Pauli calls his work an active fantasy about the unconscious, and he dedicates to Marie-Louise von Franz. In this fantasy, he arrives at the home of von Franz, where he's taken back to 1930 and given a piano lesson by a dark-haired lady. He learns to play the light and dark keys in various combinations of chords. The lesson is interspersed with allusions to his and von Franz's childhoods in Vienna. The dark anima begins to assume the appearances of Pauli's Chinese anima. Pauli is prodded to deliver a lecture to the strangers who have gathered at the window. He does go ahead and do this. It's a lecture whose subject is basically about biophysics, biological, and concerns the phenomena of life and the possible role of ESP phenomena, especially meaningful coincidences in the biochemistry of life processes. So he goes on at length about that and delivers in the fantasy a lecture. The Chinese anima figure tells Pauli that she is carrying his child and she wants him to legitimize it. He is willing to do so he prepares to leave to return to his men's world at the university, but he promises her to return. As he is leaving, she presents him with the ring eye, and he asks if he knows, and he's asked if he knows what it is. He responds with a brief mathematical description of what he knows full well what the ring eye is, and then he puts on his hat and coat and leaves, apparently without taking the ring. Well, what is the ring eye? You remember, think back to high school, maybe earlier, you encountered square roots. Square root of 4 is 2, right? If you ever encountered the square root of -4, then you've encountered a negative square root. You've encountered an imaginary number. Let's think of the simplest imaginary number. It would be the square root of -1. So that's the unit imaginary, and that's what's coming up here with the I. The I stands for the unit imaginary, stands for the square root of -1. Now, mathematicians for millennia had real problems when they encountered square roots of negative numbers. They couldn't imagine what it could be. And it wasn't until the early 19th century that they could actually visualize imaginary numbers. They had a way to geometrically understand them. And what you see before you is that understanding, and Pauli has called it the ring eye. Okay, Pauli knows all about this. He probably, given his accelerated learning, probably studied imaginary numbers when he was 12 or 13 years old. He knows everything that he feels he needs to know about the ring eye. So he probably just leaves, neglecting to take it from his anima because he already has it. He knows all about that stuff. Okay. Strangely enough, not strangely enough, quite predictable, I guess, as you look at it. His relationship with von Franz would end by mid-1955. Problems came when she would ask him to share his associations with various aspects of his dreams, and he refused to do that. He refused to take her seriously as one capable of helping him analytically, and he, in fact, refused to take himself seriously in the process. And she tired of that, and they ended their relationship. Now, towards the end of 1955, Pauli's father died at a ripe old age of a weak heart. And only a few weeks later, in December 1, the woman who he was briefly married to, Kitty Deppner, finds him when he's lecturing in Hamburg, and they spend a couple hours talking to each other as he's leaving, and he's catching up on 30 years with this woman that had been, such a major part of his life for such a short time. This seems to be a sort of a settling out of issues in his life, a settling down and a dying out. And in fact, what seems to be happening, Pauli is moving away from his engagement with psychological issues. He's returning to the university. He's given up hope for bridging the realm of physis and psyche. And things are going downhill for him. And they get much worse the next year. In 1957, imagine a physics experiment getting front page news on the New York Times. Well, this one did. And what has happened is that there's a report of an experiment, much of it performed by people at Columbia University in New York, about parity violation. Well, what is parity violation, and why should anyone care about that? why should it receive front page news status? Parity is a more formal word for a mirror symmetry. So in other words, the image reflected in a mirror has parity, or is expected to be symmetric. Let's imagine you can hold up in your hand the entire universe, and you have a mirror in your other hand, and you hold a mirror up to the entire universe, and imagine that you can move into the mirror reflected universe and inspect it and see if it's in any way possible different from the mirror in your other hand, from the universe in your other hand. Almost everyone would have said, no, the mirror reflection of the universe would be completely indistinguishable from the actual universe. So, and Pauli, more than others, was totally devoted to the notion of the symmetry of the universe. He would never have agreed that this was a possibility. Much of his intuition, and he was a strongly intuitive thinker, was wrapped around the symmetries of the universe. The experiment showed that, in fact, symmetry was violated, parity was violated. As Pauli would write about, he said, God is a weak left-hander after all. That's a nice kind of throw-off comment, but he was devastated. He was absolutely devastated by this. He had very little to stand on in sense of his intuitions were now, brought into being suspect. He couldn't even trust his intuitions. And so this was a hard time for him. It was a friend would say, well, Pauli, you have a mirror complex. And in fact, he truly did. Now, this was called the Chinese Revolution when this happened. And why was it called the Chinese Revolution? Because three of the principal researchers for this experiment were Chinese from mainland China, though they were living and working and being American citizens. Two theorists had come up with this experiment in the first place. It was Chong Dao Li and Chen Ning Yang, and they had the idea that one could actually test to see if parity was violated. And they convinced the other folk that sat around the table in the Chinese restaurant that they ate their lunch at that they should try this, and they did. And lo and behold, parity was violated. One of the principal experimentalists at Columbia University who actually carried out the experiment was Chen Wu. That's Chen Wu. Pauli met her in 1941 at Berkeley. And he would write to Jung, he would say, I met Mrs. C.S. Wu in Berkeley in 1941 and was very impressed by her both as an experimental physicist and as an intelligent and beautiful Chinese young lady. In the meantime, she's married a Chinese and has a son. So he wrote that to Jung in 1957. Pauli returns to the Eta to teach, but not for long. In 1958, he's in the lecture hall teaching when he experiences severe abdominal pains, and he leaves. He has to go home. He takes a taxi home. The next day, he is admitted to the Red Cross hospital in Zurich, and by the 15th, he's died of pancreatic cancer. There's a very odd circumstance associated with this particular leaving, in that in the hospital, he was in room 137. Now, the reciprocal of 137, 1 over 137, is a magic number to physicists. It's called the fine structure constant, and it came up with, remember that first professor that he worked with in Munich, his name was Sommerfeld. It came up in that fellow's work, the fine structure constant, was this dimensionless number, 1 over 137. Nobody knew how or why you should get a number like 1 over 137 and not 1 over 254, or who knows, any other number. And it wasn't dependent on the scales, the measuring equipment or whatever that one was using. It was a pure number. So physicists for decades puzzled over, what does it mean? Why 137? And in this odd way, Pauli would leave the existence in room 137. Jung lived longer, as we know, to 1961. And 2 years before his death, he would take the collected notes that he had on number archetypes, which were not much. And this was what he gave her. And he said to her, "I am too old to be able to write this now, so I hand it over to you." And that's where I'll end it, with what would then go on to be the sort of the second part of this story, with Franz spending 10 years to articulate what she learned about number archetypes. But thank you all very much for this, and let's open up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Charles. Yeah, I think I really love how you came around to all this heart things at the end, and it really illuminates the personal nature of the work that von Franz did after. Like, now that I see the connection between her and Pauli, and how she was wrapped up in all of it, that's a really interesting point. So thank you. Yeah, any other, like, yeah, let's hear what people think, questions that have come up or regarding this material.
Does anybody have a synchronistic experience you'd like to share?
Oh, I have one I could share.
Please do.
It's kind of crazy, but it's the absolute truth.
Right.
My mother was living in Connecticut with her friend, and she and her friend used to go to New York City to see a play in the afternoon, and then they would go to Grand Central Station and take the train home. So they were walking through on their way home, and the phone was ringing in Grand Central Station, and my mother's friend gravitated to answer. My mother's like, "What are you doing?" She's like, "I'm answering the phone. I have no idea why. Why would I answer the phone?" And she lifts up the phone, and it's her good friend, and it's for her. And she says, "What? How are you phoning me here? I'm in Grand Central Station." And in those days, when it was those phones, they had the number of the payphone in the center, and she had dialed one number off, and that was the number in Grand Central Station that this woman picked up, and it was her good friend phoning her at home, but got her in Grand Central Station. And she would never, ever normally answer the phone. Right. Very, very strange.
Wow, that's cool.
That was pretty cool. I did want to ask, I wanted to ask you about archetypal numbers. What does that mean?
Well, there's great divergence of opinion about what that means. I will just talk about first what Jung thought it meant, which was basically just the natural numbers, the counting numbers, but the symbolic content that we associate with the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. he had collected on that little scrap of paper that he gave to von Franz, just notes about some of the symbolic aspects of those numbers. And that's what von Franz worked with primarily, as she was, carried out dutifully what Jung had asked her to do. But if you read Number and Time, which was her response to this task, it's clear that there's much more going on than just the counting numbers. The numbers take on much more than a single serializing of objects or whatever. They have issues around energy and patterns of energy and behaviors. So archetypal energy, so to speak, becomes very much tied up with number. That's a whole nother very long discussion to have, just to get through what von Franz learned in her studies. And then people have taken it in other directions since then. And we know archetypes can have a multitude of representations. And so people choose their favorite representations, and often they mistakenly think they've captured the notion of what a number archetype is by looking at their favorite representations. But it's in fact almost inexhaustible what we could mean by number archetype.
I thought what you said about Pauli was interesting, Charles. When you said that he didn't want to touch number archetype. Remember, you said he walked away from that.
Right. With a very short answer, almost one word answer, is Gödel. Kurt Gödel was a logician. Again, he was at Princeton. He was a friend, confidant, well-known, although a very solitary person, who was a logician that studied the limits of logic. And one of the things that he showed, again, very surprisingly to logicians and to people who paid attention to what the impacts of those words, is that you could not, contrary to what these thinkers thought was the case, you could not construct a complete account of reality based on counting numbers. Okay. Again, that's another whole long story. There is a book actually written about this by Robin Robertson, who unfortunately passed away a little more than a year ago. He was an editor on psychological perspectives down and out of the LA Institute. And he has a book in which he goes thoroughly into why counting numbers can't really do what Jung would have wanted them to do in terms of their archetypal behavior. Well, it's true, but there's much more to numbers than the counting numbers, and what Jung was fixated on, and to a great degree what von Franz was fixated on. But then that's why Pauli had his reticence, I'm sure. Pauli knew Kurt Gödel, and he knew the implications of his theorem, and said, "Oh, I'm not going there. I'm not going to worry about natural numbers."
Yeah, I think
he wasn't just referring to natural numbers. He probably was referring to, well, he didn't say. I mean, you didn't enlarge on that, but of course one could get into geometry and all sorts of other the laws and so on, and you didn't get into that, but those areas really interest me. I'm not going to get into it here or now. There's no time, but I've done a lot of research myself on this subject. But what I mentioned is that Pauli walked away from it. And I found that interesting because it was probably a smart thing to do. Just get out of the room, because there's so much to discuss in this area that he just wanted to, head for the door.
I think it might
Well,
be a,
and you're quite right, and quite right with all the comments that you made there, and they do, it'd be fun to explore them sometime. But yes, Pauli was afraid to proceed with that, and he was also arrogant. He thought he knew it all that he needed to know about that subject anyway, exhaustively, and that he didn't want to be rude and tell Jung or von Franz that they were on the wrong track. So he let it go.
Right. It's too bad. It would have been an interesting discussion, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Paul, did you have a question?
Especially with making a relationship to the psyche, with anything archetypal, whatever. I mean, it would have been an interesting discussion for him to have added something to it.
Oh, for sure. He died at 59, age 59.
Paul,
Yeah.
you had a question.
Yeah, I'm wondering, can you analyze synchronistic phenomena, or do they not work like that? Can you analyze them like you would analyze a dream in terms of symbols and get to some kind of meaning, or can you not go there?
You can, in the sense of a psychological interpretation, you may very well be able to look at shared archetypes, because that's what is being expressed there as an archetype. In terms of the synchronicity in the narrow sense, you have an archetype operating in both the physical realm and the psychological realm. And now that can be sort of generalized in that you have very commonly, so in a synchronistic reports, you have death. I gave you some examples of that, or illness and death, and there are also major events like birth. So those kinds of things are sort of archetypal circumstances where these things come up. This, interesting enough, the telephone archetype is kind of a subset of that category. This connectedness that the telephone offers. I have a friend whose mother in Italy rang his phone while he was dreaming and basically said a few words to him. And he says, "Mom, you never call me," in the dream. And then he wakes up and he calls Italy, and his mother has passed into a coma and is proceeded on to dying, then in death. And that was essentially his last contact with his mother, was in the dream. So prior to the invention of the telephone, that category of synchronicity wouldn't be available.
On the one hand, it seems like parallel realities, physical, psychological. On the other hand, it seems like one archetype is inspiring both physical and psychological, and just crops up in different ways at the same time, because one is physical and one is psychological. Seems like 6 of one and half a dozen of the other almost, yeah.
But you're quite right. And in fact, that's where it gets to. And remember, Jung got to the point of talking about it, unus mundus, where you don't have a distinction between a physical realm separated from a psychological realm. They are a whole, or holism, psychophysical unity, totally. And the archetype is working across that unus mundus and doing what it's doing.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Just taking a look at the clock here, just wanting to thank everyone for coming. I do not feel the need to close things down. Anybody who wants to stay and continue with the conversation, I'm happy to keep this chat open until 9:30 or so. But just wanting to thank everyone for coming. If anybody needs to sign off, and also just to, with everyone, thank Charles for his amazing presentation, and the amount of detail and knowledge that he has about this collaboration was really great. So thank you, Charles.
Oh, you're welcome.
I concur, Charles. Appreciated your talk, and happy to have seen you again, and all you people there in Victoria. Perhaps I'll get back one day, but if you hold some more Zoom meetings, we can we can do it this way too. So nice to
Well,
talk
we
to you.
can,
Nice
we
to
can
talk.
Zoom or Skype sometime to talk further about what you're interested
Yeah, we've really liked the Young Cafes as a really informal sort of way just to share ideas. So encourage anybody who has a specific topic that they want to explore. You know, that's part of what we do is we want to take people's interests because and explore them, find presenters, arrange talking groups, arrange these like sorts of information. And that's what we want to do. We want to bring to you guys what's important to you. So please, by all means, if you have suggestions, reach out. If you guys want to come to a board meeting, see what we do, contribute to forming our content, please, by all means, reach out. We'd love to have you. Yeah, and I also just wanted to say, Sally, just like when you asked, you know, about the number archetype, I found when I first started learning about number archetypes, it was like that same moment where you think about when you realize that fairy tales are a kind of psychological blueprint, that numbers kind of function in the same way. Like it was a bit of like, whoa, when I first when that first kind of clicked in and I read some von Franz and yeah, I think about tarot cards and that kind of stuff. Even anybody who just looks at, you know, what the number 1, 2, 3 stand for symbolically, you know, then it kind of takes off from there, you know, more than just counting, you know, it's like 1 as being like a birth, 2 as a lover, like as lovers, or as like divergent sides, 3 as like you know, like, you know, the third wheel type of complications that come in with 3 and 4 as like a solid wholeness and stuff. It's really interesting stuff. If you haven't like looked into it before, perhaps Charles can recommend some reading on synchronicity and on number archetypes for us. What would you say,
Thanks.
Charles?
Thanks, Geneva. That's really interesting. I appreciate that.
When I started out in the late 70s on the number archetypes, the shelf space you needed for English language publications was about that much available for books and papers and so forth. And now it's expanded. Oh, you probably need 2 meters to put all of the different books and other publications that are in there, and so there's this huge amount. It's yeah.
Charles, could you summarize what that parody experiment eventually showed? What I got out of it was that the mirror reflection was different than the reality. Would that
Well,
be?
in a teeny tiny way, let's say you could imagine another universe that was an actual universe you could move around in, but it was the mirror image of the universe that we're in now. Okay, somehow we can walk through the mirror conceptually, and we can get into that other universe and poke around in it and measure things. Would we notice anything at all different, right? Physicists found that there is a teeny tiny difference between the two, and it has to do with what's called the weak force, which is just what it is, a very weak force dealing with atomic forces, and that's why it took you know, it's not a noticeable effect at all, and took very sophisticated physics of the day for the people in the mid 1950s to be able to carry this out and
No,
determine
but what they're basically saying is that one is different from the other.
in a teeny tiny little way that you'd never notice.
Yeah, right, you never noticed, but that really goes back to Plato's allegory of the cave, where the pure form is different from the reflected image. That's what that goes back to.
Yeah, you could take it back there, sure.
Yeah, and he's trying to show that they're-
Plato would have as much difficulty as Pauli did with it too, because it would be contrary to Plato's intuition of how things are too.
yeah, I'm glad that Plato isn't around anymore. His ideas need to be terminated. They're old hat. They're old hat.
Well, they are.
Yeah. Anyway, nice to see you, and I'm going to say good night for now, Charles.
Okay, good night.
Good night, Jackie. Nice to see you. Yeah, I think if you want to wax full philosophical about mirrors and whatnot, is when you look in the mirror, is that person the exact same person standing on the other side of the mirror, right? I don't know.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
You
But
get all
what
sort
I'm
of
saying is that-
philosophical about that question.
what I'm saying is a metaphor. In fact, let's just imagine that you could walk through that mirror and encounter that person on the other side of the mirror, right? And get out your thermometer and your measuring sticks and so forth and see, wow, is that person any different from the one on this other side? And you would find in a very, very subtle and hard to measure way that there was a tiny, tiny bit of difference. Yeah.
And I guess as physicists, they can get really minute in there.
Extraordinary.
Right? Yeah, like I think that, and I don't know, I wonder, like, Charles, you're the physicist here, but it's like, I wonder if part of like Pauli's not wanting to get into the whole natural number thing is because physicists they don't really deal in natural numbers, right? Don't physicists deal in the point, in the 0.0, right?
The decimal numbers.
The 0.0000000. Like, so I could see why, and I had a conversation actually with a friend of mine who's a quantum physicist. And he's like, yeah, and never the two shall meet. Natural numbers are a different beast and have different rules than decimal numbers, right? So I don't know.
That's a fair statement to make. You can do this kind of a relationship between one as a natural number, as an accounting number, and 1.0000 ad infinitum. You can line those up and say they correspond to the same thing, but it is a correspondence. When mathematicians actually study them, they have to study them as separate systems. The natural numbers are separate from the real numbers, or separate from the complex numbers.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating in when you talk about the unquantifiableness of the psyche. Like, it's kind of like a decimal number. You can't ever know it completely, just like the numbers in the decimal go on forever, right? Anyways.
Yep.
I want to know where synchronicity met the relationship between von Franz and Pauli. One side of that story seems so left brain, and the other one is so completely emotional. And it's
Right.
like, whoa, where's the common ground?
Well, there was an extensive correspondence between von Franz and Pauli, and half of it still exists. The letters that Pauli wrote to von Franz are, I believe they're at the ETH in the archives there, and they can be examined. They haven't been published. I don't know. You know that Chiron Press is publishing her collected works over the next 10 years, and it's 20 volumes, and it's a good nickel you have to pay for each volume that's coming out.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody will work on her half, or well, the half that she collected of what he wrote. It'd be nice if they did, but that's a huge editorial prospect. The half, or whatever, the quote that she wrote to him were in his office at the ETH when he died, and Pauli's wife Franca bundled them up and tossed them in the fire.
Yeah.
It would have been nice if somebody could have foretold that and copied them we don't know that that ever happened, but for all intents and purposes, they don't exist. So only half the story is there. I suspect they definitely got into discussions of synchronicity and such. It was what was on the table at that time. She had helped him with his Kepler essay. She had helped Jung with his alchemic studies and translations, and all of this, flowed very naturally into the synchronistic work.
We should hold a fundraiser to get a copy of her works for the library. Then everybody can take a peek. Her stuff is fascinating. I find her stuff, like, except for some of her stuff isn't very accessible at all. Like, I was reading Creation Myths, and I think her chime and number and time, or time and number, I forget what it is that you mentioned.
Time, yeah.
Yeah, I feel are difficult reads, but lots of her stuff on fairy tales I find very good.
Yeah.
Instructive. So where are we at, you guys? Is there any other questions or comments at all about the presentation tonight? I appreciate you guys sticking around to hang out with us. It's awesome.
Let me just say, if there's anything you want to follow up on at any time, just email me. You can get me one way. It's just the easiest one to say to you is just card, CARD, at uvic.ca, uvic.ca. So just email me and we can chat that way too.
Yeah, and stay tuned. We're going to have one more event, probably in about a month in April. I think what's hopefully going to be an in-person event. It's probably very informal somewhere, but yeah, I hope to see you guys out, and thank you so much for your support and for coming out. We there's always a question mark, or who's going to come, or if anybody, or will it just be the board? Luckily, we have a fair amount of fun together, just hanging out. So that's okay, but we appreciate you guys coming out. So
good night, all. Thanks for being here.
Good night,
Thanks, Charles.
everybody.
That was great. Yeah.
Take care, and we'll see you soon, I
Cheers.
hope.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you for coming. Thanks for your questions and for participating, Sally. It's great. Bye-bye. And Paul.
Yeah, thanks so much for putting this on. That's great, Geneva.
Okay. See you later. Good night.
Bye-bye.